Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about sleeping pills. This is a story about the space between consciousness and oblivion, the place where people do things they'll never remember, say things they can't take back, and become strangers wearing their own faces. A single pill, FDA approved, doctor prescribed. It has ended more marriages than affairs ever could, because at least with cheating, someone chooses to betray you. With this, your partner simply leaves, while their body stays in bed beside you. Phone away. Lights dim. Let's begin. Picture this. It's 2:47 in the morning. A bedroom in suburban Ohio, the kind of bedroom you've seen 1,000 times. Beige carpet, wedding photos on the dresser, a ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark. The house is quiet, the way houses are quiet, when everyone's supposed to be asleep. Sarah wakes up, not because of a sound exactly, something else, that animal part of your brain that knows when something's wrong before you know what it is. The covers next to her are pushed back. The bed is empty. She sits up, blinks, lets her eyes adjust to the darkness, and there he is, Michael, her husband of 11 years, standing at the dresser back to her, the pale glow of his phone illuminating his face from below, like a child telling a ghost story with a flashlight. Except children don't stand that still. Children don't hold themselves like that. Shoulders slightly wrong, posture slightly off, like a mannequin someone arranged into an approximation of a person. Michael? He doesn't turn around, doesn't acknowledge her at all. His thumbs keep moving across the screen. Tap, tap, tap. The soft click of keys in the silence. Michael, what are you doing? Nothing. He might as well be alone in the room. She might as well be furniture. She gets out of bed, walks toward him, and this is when she sees his eyes. They're open, wide open. But that's the thing about the Ambien look that nobody prepares you for. The eyes aren't closed, they aren't even unfocused exactly. They're just wrong. Present but absent. The lights are on but nobody's home. Later she'll describe it to a divorce attorney like this. He was looking at me the way you'd look at a lamp, like I was just another object in the room. Who are you texting at 3 in the morning? His thumbs stop. He looks at her, through her. Then he looks back at his phone. She takes it from his hands. He doesn't resist, doesn't even seem to notice it's gone, just stands there, staring at his empty hands like they belong to someone else. The screen is still lit. The conversation is still open. The messages are to her sister. Sexual, explicit, detailed. The kind of messages that describe specific acts, specific desires, specific things he wants to do to her, things he apparently wants to do to her sister. Timestamps going back 40 minutes. A conversation that started while Sarah was asleep 3 feet away. Her sister's responses are confused at first. Michael, is this you? Then concerned. Are you okay? This is really weird. Then silence when the messages kept coming anyway. Sarah reads them all, every word. Her hands are shaking. The phone is shaking. The whole world is shaking. She looks at Michael. Michael looks at nothing. What is this? What the hell is this? He blinks, slow, like someone underwater. Then he turns, walks back to the bed, lies down, pulls the covers over himself and closes his eyes. Within 30 seconds his breathing slows. He's asleep, actually asleep. The deep, steady breathing of someone with nothing on their conscience. Sarah stands in the dark holding his phone, reading messages that will end her marriage, watching her husband sleep like a baby. She doesn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sits in the living room with the lights on, reading the messages over and over, waiting for them to make sense. They never do. Morning comes. Michael comes downstairs, pours himself coffee, asks if she slept okay. He doesn't remember. Not the messages, not the conversation, not standing at the dresser, not her voice calling his name, not her taking his phone, not going back to bed. Nothing. Zero. A complete blank from 10 p.m. when he took his Ambien to 7 a.m. when his alarm went off. He looks at the text she shows him with genuine horror. That's the part that makes it worse. He's not acting. He's not pretending. He looks at those messages like a stranger wrote them, like someone else used his hands, his phone, his words to describe explicit acts with his wife's sister. "I didn't write these," he says. But he did. The phone records prove it. His fingerprint unlocked the screen. His number sent the messages. His words, his thumbs, his brain. "That's not me," he says. "That's not who I am." She wants to believe him. Part of her does believe him. The part that knows the man she married, the father of her children, the person she's built a life with for 11 years. But the messages exist. The words were sent. Her sister received them. And somewhere in the dark, in the space between sleep and waking, something wearing her husband's face had thoughts about her sister that her husband swears he's never had. The marriage doesn't survive, not because she thinks he cheated, not because she thinks he's lying. It ends because of something worse than either of those things. It ends because she doesn't know anymore. Doesn't know if those messages came from some buried part of him, some hidden desire he's never acknowledged. Doesn't know if the man lying next to her every night is the man she thinks he is, or if there's someone else in there, someone who comes out when the lights go off and the Ambien kicks in. "How can I trust you?" she asks, the week before she files, "when I don't know who you are at 3 a.m. He doesn't have an answer. Neither does anyone else. If this were one story, it would be a tragedy, a marriage destroyed by a medical fluke, a neurological misfire, a terrible accident of brain chemistry. But this isn't one story. Jennifer from Minnesota drove 43 miles to her ex-boyfriend's apartment. She doesn't remember getting in her car, doesn't remember the drive, the turns, the traffic lights, doesn't remember anything until she woke up the next morning in her own bed. Car keys on her nightstand, 43 miles on her odometer that weren't there the night before, and a confused voicemail from an ex she hadn't seen in 6 years asking why she'd showed up at 2 a.m., knocked on his door and stared at him without speaking, before turning around and leaving. Her husband found out. Her husband didn't understand. Her husband filed for divorce. Robert from Texas woke up to his children crying. His wife showed him the video she'd recorded on her phone. In it, Robert is standing in his son's bedroom, screaming. Not yelling, screaming. Words a father should never say to a child. Words about worthlessness, about mistakes, about never wanting him to be born. His 8-year-old is pressed against the headboard, sobbing. His 6-year-old is in the doorway, frozen. Robert watched the video 17 times, trying to recognize himself, trying to understand. He'd taken his Ambien and gone to bed. He'd never had a violent thought toward his children in his life. His kids are afraid of him now, afraid of nighttime, afraid of daddy after dark. No amount of explaining helps. They don't understand pharmacology. They don't understand parasomnia. They understand that daddy screamed at them and said terrible things, and the fact that daddy doesn't remember makes it worse, not better. Because if daddy doesn't remember, then daddy might do it again. The marriage is ongoing. The family therapy is ongoing. The fear is ongoing. The Ambien is gone, but what it did remains. Patricia from Florida emptied her family's savings account at 4 a.m. She doesn't remember opening her laptop, doesn't remember logging into Amazon, Best Buy, Wayfair, doesn't remember ordering $34,000 worth of merchandise in 3 hours, furniture they didn't need, electronics they already had, 17 identical instant pots, a commercial-grade pizza oven, a $6,000 massage chair. The packages started arriving 2 days later, box after box after box. Her husband thought it was a mistake, a hack, identity theft. Then the credit card statements came. Then the shipping confirmations with her email address, her password, her saved payment information. She stared at a living room full of boxes she didn't order and couldn't explain. Her husband stared at her. "What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking. I wasn't there." He couldn't understand, couldn't process. A woman he'd trusted with their finances for 15 years had blown through their savings on random garbage, and her only explanation was that she didn't remember doing it. The returns took months. The trust took longer. The marriage survived, barely, but something in it died. Some fundamental assumption about knowing the person you're married to. Michelle from Oregon told her husband the truth at 3 a.m., or what the Ambien let her believe was the truth, or what her unconscious mind decided to release when her conscious mind went offline. She told him she'd never loved him, told him she'd married him because she was pregnant and scared, told him she thought about her college boyfriend every time they had sex, told him she'd faked every orgasm for 12 years, told him their children were the only reason she stayed, and sometimes they weren't enough. He lay there in the dark, listening to his wife confess things she'd apparently been holding back for over a decade. In the morning she remembered none of it, but he remembered everything. "Did you mean it?" he asked her, and kept asking. "I don't know," she said. "I don't remember saying it. I don't think I believe those things. But I don't know. I don't know what's in my head when I'm not in my head. What do you do with that? How do you unhear a confession your partner doesn't remember making? How do you trust someone who might be harboring secret truths that only emerge when their conscious mind is disabled?" He couldn't answer those questions. Neither could she. The marriage ended not because of what she said, but because of the uncertainty that remained after. The permanent doubt. The forever question. Was that the real her, or was it noise? And how would either of them ever know? These aren't isolated incidents. These people weren't drunk, weren't high, weren't on anything illegal. They'd followed their doctor's instructions. They'd taken their prescribed medication. They'd gone to bed expecting to sleep. Instead, they became strangers wearing their own faces. They did things, said things, destroyed things, while their conscious selves were somewhere else entirely. And in the morning, they woke up to the wreckage they couldn't explain and the marriages they couldn't save. So here's the question. What do these people have in common? Geography? No. They're scattered across the country. Age? No. They range from their 20s to their 60s. Mental health history? No. Most had none. Alcohol use? In some cases, yes. In most cases, no. The common thread is a small pill, an oval tablet, usually white or pink, sometimes with a name stamped on it, sometimes generic. A pill that fits in the palm of your hand and disappears under your tongue and promises nothing more than a good night's sleep. Ambien. Zolpidem tartrate. If you want the chemistry, a non-benzodiazepine hypnotic. If you want the classification, the most prescribed sleep medication in American history. If you want the superlative, at its peak, doctors wrote over 40 million prescriptions for Ambien annually. 40 million. In a country of 330 million people, that means roughly 1 in 8 American adults was prescribed Ambien in a single year. A pill that was supposed to be for short-term use was being refilled month after month, year after year, decade after decade. It wasn't hard to get. You went to your doctor, said you couldn't sleep, and walked out with a prescription. Insurance covered it. Generics made it cheap. There were no special requirements, no monitoring protocols, no mandatory warnings about what might happen if you took it and didn't go immediately to bed. The marketing was beautiful. Soft lighting, peaceful imagery. A butterfly became the symbol, delicate and gentle, landing on a sleeping woman's shoulder. The message was clear. This is natural. This is safe. This is the rest you deserve. The pharmaceutical company, Sanofi, positioned Ambien as the enlightened choice. Not like those old barbiturates that killed people. Not like those addictive benzodiazepines that left you groggy. Ambien was modern, scientific, a precision instrument for sleep, targeting the exact receptors that needed targeting, doing the job and getting out. The FDA approved it in 1992. The doctors prescribed it in droves. The patients took it by the tens of millions. And somewhere in the fine print, somewhere in the clinical trial data, somewhere in the adverse event reports that started accumulating almost immediately, there was another story, a story about what happened when the pill didn't just put you to sleep, a story about the gap between the marketing and the reality, between the butterfly landing gently on your shoulder and the stranger standing at the dresser at 3 a.m., texting things you'll never remember to people you'll never be able to face again. Here's the question that nobody can answer, the question that haunts every marriage Ambien touched, the question that keeps divorce attorneys up at night and makes philosophers throw up their hands. If someone does something they don't remember doing, are they responsible? If your husband sends sexual messages to your sister while in an Ambien fugue state, is that cheating? Is that betrayal? Is that his fault? He didn't choose to do it. He wasn't conscious when it happened. The part of his brain that makes decisions, that weighs consequences, that understands right from wrong, that part was offline. Something else was driving. Something with access to his memories and his phone and his vocabulary, but not his judgment, not his values, not his self. So who sent those messages? And here's the harder question. If someone says something they claim not to believe, do they mean it? Michelle told her husband she'd never loved him. She says she doesn't believe that. Says she doesn't remember saying it. Says her conscious mind has never thought those thoughts, but the words came from her brain. They used her voice. They employed her memories, her experiences, her specific knowledge of their specific relationship. The Ambien didn't invent content. It unlocked something. The question is, what? Was it the truth, finally released from the prison of social constraint? Was it noise, random neural firing shaped into sentences by a brain that constructs language automatically? Was it something in between, a fear, not a fact, an anxiety, not an accusation, a thought she'd had once and dismissed, now given voice by a drug that removed her ability to dismiss anything? Nobody knows. That's the horror of it. Nobody, not Michelle, not her husband, not the doctors, not the researchers, not the FDA. Nobody can tell you whether Ambien reveals truth or manufactures fiction. The drug doesn't come with a label that says confessions made under the influence may or may not reflect the user's actual beliefs. And that uncertainty is the real poison, because you can forgive someone for doing something they didn't mean to do. You can forgive an accident. You can forgive a mistake. You can even forgive a betrayal with enough time and therapy and commitment. But you can't forgive uncertainty. You can't build a marriage on, I don't know if my partner secretly despises me. You can't trust someone when the question, who are you really, has no answer. This is the philosophical horror of Ambien that nobody warned people about when they picked up their prescriptions. It doesn't just affect your body. It doesn't just affect your sleep. It affects your personhood. It creates a gap between who you are and what you do, between your identity and your actions. And into that gap fall marriages, trust, families, entire lives. So here's where we're going tonight. How did we get here? How did a sleep pill become a marriage destroyer? How did a medication approved by the FDA and prescribed by doctors and advertised with butterflies end up doing more damage to American relationships than infidelity ever could? The answers take us through the history of American sleeplessness, the science of consciousness, the economics of pharmaceutical marketing, and the regulatory failures that let millions of people become strangers to themselves and the people who loved them. It's not a simple story. It's not a story with villains you can hate and heroes you can cheer. It's a story about systems that failed, science that got ignored, warnings that went unheeded, and marriages that burned while the pills kept flowing. Dim the lights if you haven't already. We're going deep, and the darkness is appropriate, because that's where this story lives, in the space between sleep and waking, in the gap between who you are and who you become at 3 a.m., in the silence of a bedroom where someone you love isn't there anymore, even though their body never left. Let's begin. To understand how we got here, how a pill that turns people into strangers became the most prescribed sleep medication in American history, you first have to understand what we were running from, not the concept of sleeplessness, the actual physical, neurological experience of a brain denied the one thing it cannot function without. Let's start with the science, the brutal, unforgiving science of what happens when you don't sleep. After 24 hours without sleep, your cognitive function degrades to the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.10%. That's legally drunk in every state in America. You can't legally drive a car, but you can go to work, make decisions, operate machinery, care for children, perform surgery. Nobody's going to stop you. Nobody's going to test you. You're just impaired in a way that's completely invisible and completely legal. Your reaction time slows, your judgment warps, your ability to assess risk, to weigh consequences, to think through problems, all of it degrades. You become a worse version of yourself, making worse decisions with no awareness that anything's wrong. After 36 hours, the memory dysfunction starts. Your brain can't consolidate new information properly. You're forgetting things you learnt an hour ago. Emotional regulation begins to collapse. Small frustrations become rage. Minor setbacks become despair. The part of your brain that keeps your emotions proportional to their causes starts glitching. After 48 hours, you start experiencing microsleeps. Your brain forces you into seconds-long episodes of unconsciousness. Whether you want them or not, you're awake, and then you're not, and then you're awake again, with no transition, no warning. People have crashed cars this way, operated heavy equipment this way, dropped babies this way. Your brain is so desperate for sleep that it takes it by force in stolen moments you can't control. After 72 hours, the hallucinations begin. Visual distortions first, shadows that move wrong, shapes in your peripheral vision that aren't there, then auditory hallucinations, sounds that don't exist, voices that aren't speaking, then full psychotic episodes, paranoia, delusions, the complete breakdown of the boundary between what's real and what your sleep-starved brain is manufacturing to fill the gaps. This isn't theory, this is documented, this is studied, this is what governments discovered when they started using sleep deprivation as an interrogation technique, which is a polite way of saying torture. The CIA's enhanced interrogation program kept detainees awake for up to 180 hours, 7.5 days. The subjects became psychotic, became compliant, became willing to say anything, confess to anything, just to be allowed to sleep. The Soviets used it, the Chinese used it, the Spanish Inquisition used it, centuries before anyone understood the neuroscience. They didn't need to understand the neuroscience. They understood the results. Sleep deprivation breaks people. Reliably, predictably, completely. But here's the thing, those are acute cases. Extreme deprivation under extreme circumstances. What about the chronic version? What about the tens of millions of Americans who don't go 72 hours without sleep, but go years sleeping 6 hours or less? The damage compounds. Chronic sleep deprivation triggers systemic inflammation. Your immune system starts attacking your own tissues. The risk of heart disease climbs. Stroke risk climbs. Diabetes risk climbs. Your metabolism shifts toward fat storage. Your appetite hormones malfunction, making you hungrier for exactly the foods your body doesn't need. Mental health collapse follows. Depression and chronic sleep deprivation are so intertwined that researchers struggle to determine which causes which. Anxiety amplifies. The emotional volatility of acute sleep loss becomes a permanent feature rather than a temporary state. And your brain starts eating itself. That's not a metaphor. In 2017, researchers discovered that chronic sleep deprivation triggers the brain's glial cells, its internal cleanup crew, to start breaking down healthy synapses. The process that's supposed to clear out cellular debris starts clearing out the connections you need. Your brain, starved of the sleep it requires to function, begins consuming its own infrastructure. You can survive without food for 3 weeks, without water for 3 days, without sleep. Your brain begins destroying itself while you watch, helpless to stop it, because the one thing that would stop it, sleep, is the one thing you can't seem to do. This is what America was experiencing. Not as individuals making bad choices, but as a nation caught in systems that made sleep nearly impossible to obtain. And when you're that desperate, you'll take whatever solution presents itself, even if the solution creates problems nobody warned you about. Here's a question worth asking. Were humans always this bad at sleeping? The answer is no, and understanding how we got here explains why we got desperate enough to accept what came next. Before the Industrial Revolution, humans slept differently, not just more, differently. Historical records, personal diaries, medical texts from the pre-industrial era describe something called segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep. People would go to bed when it got dark, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, then sleep again until dawn. That middle of the night waking wasn't insomnia, it wasn't a disorder, it was normal, expected. People used that time to pray, to think, to talk to their partners, to have sex. There are references in medieval literature to first sleep and second sleep as distinct phases of the night, as unremarkable as breakfast and lunch. Sleep was regulated by darkness. When the sun went down, the world went dark, real dark. No streetlights, no screens, no electric glow bleeding through the curtains. Darkness was absolute, and in that darkness, Sleep came naturally because there was nothing else to do. Then came artificial light. The gas lamp started it. Suddenly, the night could be pushed back. Streets could be illuminated. Factories could run second shifts. The boundary between day and night, which had governed human behavior for hundreds of thousands of years, began to blur. Then came Edison, the electric light bulb. Suddenly, every home could have permanent artificial daylight. Every factory could run 24 hours. Every street could be bright enough to work in, shop in, live in, regardless of what the sun was doing. And work did start running 24 hours. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how we made things, it changed how we lived. Factory shifts meant workers sleeping at odd hours. Railroad schedules meant traveling through time zones the human body wasn't designed to comprehend. The telegraph, then the telephone, meant business could happen at any hour, across any distance. Sleep became negotiable, then it became optional, then it became an obstacle. The 20th century accelerated everything. Electric light went from luxury to ubiquity. Every bedroom became a potential workspace. Every home became a potential entertainment center. The television arrived, and suddenly there was a reason to stay awake. Programming that ran until midnight, then 2 a.m., then 24 hours a day. The phrase "I'll sleep when I'm dead" entered the lexicon, and it wasn't a joke, it was an aspiration. The titans of industry bragged about sleeping 4 hours a night. CEOs wore their exhaustion as a badge of honor. The message was clear: sleep is for the weak. Sleep is for the unambitious. Sleep is what you sacrifice to get ahead. Then came the late 20th century perfect storm. The internet arrived, and suddenly the entire world was available at 3 a.m. Email created the expectation of instant response. Social media created the fear of missing out. Screens proliferated. Not just televisions now, but computers, then laptops, then tablets, then phones. Each one emitting the blue light that suppresses melatonin. Each one offering endless stimulation at the exact moment the brain is supposed to be winding down. The gig economy arrived, and suddenly a steady schedule was a luxury millions couldn't afford. Uber drivers working until 2 a.m., freelancers answering emails at midnight. Healthcare workers pulling double shifts because the system was understaffed and the bills were due. The healthcare system itself fractured. The underlying conditions that cause insomnia, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, sleep apnea went untreated because treatment cost money people didn't have. Insurance covered pills. Insurance didn't always cover therapy. Insurance definitely didn't cover the kind of life changes that might actually address why someone couldn't sleep in the first place. And the statistics tell the story. In 1942, a Gallup poll found that Americans averaged 7.9 hours of sleep per night, nearly 8 hours. The amount sleep scientists say humans actually need. By 1990, it was down to 7 hours. By 2013, it was 6.8 hours. And those are averages. Averages mean that for every person getting 8 hours, someone else is getting 5. For every person maintaining healthy sleep, someone else is falling apart. By the turn of the millennium, the CDC was calling insufficient sleep a public health epidemic. Not a problem, not a concern, an epidemic, affecting an estimated 70 million Americans, creating an estimated $411 billion in economic losses annually, contributing to car accidents, workplace injuries, medical errors, relationship breakdowns, mental health crises. America had become a nation of the sleepless, not by choice, not by weakness, but by the accumulated pressure of systems designed without sleep in mind. And the sleepless were desperate. They were exhausted. They were standing in their doctor's offices, begging for help. They were ready to accept whatever help presented itself. Of course, people had been trying to solve sleeplessness long before the 20th century. The history of sleep aids is the history of humanity's desperation, measured in toxicity. Alcohol was the first solution. Humanity's oldest sedative, a glass of wine before bed, a shot of whiskey to take the edge off. It works, sort of. Alcohol does induce unconsciousness, but the sleep it produces is garbage, disrupted REM cycles, frequent waking, morning grogginess that defeats the entire purpose, plus the whole addiction and liver damage situation. The 19th century brought bromides, potassium bromide, sodium bromide, sedatives that actually worked, that actually induced real sleep. They were also accumulating slowly in the body, causing bromism, chronic toxicity that manifested as skin rashes, neurological damage, psychosis. People took bromides to sleep better and ended up in asylums. Then came barbiturates, phenobarbital, secobarbital, the sleeping pills of the early and mid-20th century. These worked beautifully. They induced deep, genuine sleep. They were also terrifyingly easy to overdose on. The gap between a therapeutic dose and a fatal dose was dangerously narrow. Marilyn Monroe died with barbiturates in her system. So did Judy Garland. So did thousands of others, intentionally and accidentally. By the 1960s, doctors were desperate for something safer. They got benzodiazepines, Valium, Librium, Halcion, the mother's little helpers of the 1970s and 80s. These were genuinely better than barbiturates, harder to fatally overdose on, effective at inducing sleep. The pharmaceutical industry celebrated. Doctors prescribed millions of prescriptions. Then the problems emerged. Benzodiazepines were dependency-forming. People who took them for weeks found they couldn't stop. The withdrawal was brutal, anxiety worse than what they'd started with, insomnia more severe than ever, sometimes seizures, and even without dependency, there was the hangover effect. People woke up groggy, foggy, impaired. The sleep was there, but the next day was shot. By the late 1980s, the pattern was clear. Every solution created new problems. Alcohol destroyed livers, bromadides destroyed minds, barbiturates stopped hearts, benzodiazepines created dependencies. The market was waiting for something better, something that worked without the baggage, something doctors could prescribe without guilt, patients could take without fear, insurance companies could cover without hesitation. Pharmaceutical companies sense opportunity, the way sharks sense blood in the water. The opportunity here was obvious. Tens of millions of desperate sleepers, a history of inadequate solutions, a healthcare system ready to embrace anything that looked like progress. The stage was set. The need was undeniable. The market was primed. What came next was marketed as a miracle. In 1992, the FDA approved a new compound, zolpidem tartrate, trade name Ambien. The marketing was brilliant. The positioning was perfect. This wasn't just another sleeping pill. This was evolution. This was science finally catching up to the problem. Non-benzodiazepine. That was the first magic word. Ambien wasn't a benzodiazepine. It worked on some of the same receptors, but it was structurally different, categorically different. All those horror stories about Valium dependency didn't apply. This was something new. Short half-life. That was the second magic word. Ambien didn't linger in your system the way the old drugs did. Take it at night, it would be gone by morning. No grogginess, no hangover, no next day impairment. Sleep like a rock, wake up refreshed, go about your life. Lower addiction potential. That was the third magic word. The clinical trials suggested Ambien was less habit-forming than benzodiazepines. You could take it when you needed it, and stop when you didn't. No white-knuckling through withdrawal. No lifetime dependency. The commercials were beautiful. Soft focus, warm lighting, images of peaceful bedrooms and restful faces. A butterfly became the symbol, gentle and natural, landing on a sleeping woman's shoulder. The butterfly said, "This is safe. This is soft. This is the rest you've been denied. Finally available. Finally accessible. Finally here. Sleep like you used to." That was the tagline. Not sleep like a drugged person. Not sleep like someone sedated. Sleep like you used to. Before everything went wrong. Before the world got too fast. Before your brain forgot how to shut down on its own. Doctors embraced it immediately. Finally something they could prescribe without reservation. Their patients were suffering, had been suffering, and here was a solution that seemed to solve the problems of every previous solution. They wrote prescriptions by the millions. Patients embraced it even faster. This wasn't the dangerous stuff their parents had taken. This wasn't the addictive stuff that ruined lives. This was modern, scientific, approved by the FDA and covered by insurance and advertised with butterflies. Sanofi, the pharmaceutical company, watched the sales climb. First year, significant. Second year, enormous. By the mid-2000s, Ambien was generating over $2 billion annually. It became the most prescribed sleep medication in American history. It became a cultural phenomenon, a punchline, a shared experience. I am bien so hard last night. The promise was beautiful. The fine print was another story. Buried in the clinical trial data, in the adverse event reports, in the experiences of doctors who started noticing patterns, there were warning signs, reports of patients doing things they didn't remember, driving cars, making phone calls, having conversations, eating entire refrigerators of food, engaging in sexual activity. None of it remembered, all of it real, but the reports were scattered. The incidents were rare. The drug was working for so many people, helping so many people, making so much money for so many stakeholders. Who wanted to look too closely at the fine print? The FDA didn't. The doctors didn't. The patients certainly didn't, because the patients were finally sleeping, finally resting, finally getting relief from the epidemic of exhaustion that had become their normal. The promise was that Ambien would give America its sleep back. The reality was that Ambien would give America something else entirely, something that looked like sleep from the outside, something that felt like rest in the morning, but something that for millions of people came with a passenger, a stranger who emerged in the night, used their bodies, spoke their words, sent their messages, and vanished before dawn, leaving nothing behind but wreckage and confusion, and marriages that would never recover. The butterfly had landed. What it brought with it, nobody wanted to see. Not yet. So here's the question. How does a sleeping pill turn someone into a stranger? To understand that, you have to understand what Ambien actually does in your brain. Not the marketing version, the biochemistry version. Your brain runs on neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that tell neurons when to fire and when to shut up. One of the most important is called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. GABA is your brain's brake pedal. When GABA binds to its receptors, it inhibits neural activity. It slows things down. It quiets the noise. This is why alcohol makes you relaxed. Alcohol enhances GABA activity. So do benzodiazepines. So does Ambien. They all work on the same basic principle. Push the brake pedal, slow the brain, induce sedation. But here's where Ambien was supposed to be different. Benzodiazepines are blunt instruments. They bind to GABA receptors all over the brain, inhibiting everything indiscriminately. That's why they cause grogginess, memory impairment, next-day hangovers. They're suppressing functions you actually need. Ambien was designed to be selective. It targets a specific subtype of GABA receptor called the alpha-1 subunit. This receptor is concentrated in areas responsible for sedation and sleep initiation. The idea was elegant. Hit the sleep switch without touching everything else. Precision medicine, targeted therapy. The marketing emphasized this selectivity. Non-benzodiazepine, different mechanism, cleaner action. The implication was that Ambien would put you to sleep without the collateral damage. The problem is that the selectivity isn't complete. Alpha-1 receptors aren't only in sleep centers. They're distributed throughout the brain, including in areas that control motor function, judgment, and memory encoding. When you take Ambien, you're not just activating the sleep switch. You're dimming the lights on cognitive functions that were supposed to stay on. Then there's the half-life problem. Ambien was marketed on its short half-life. Take it at bedtime. It's out of your system by morning. No lingering effects, no next-day impairment. This was technically true and practically misleading. Ambien itself has a half-life of about 2.5 hours. But when your liver metabolizes Ambien, it doesn't just disappear. It breaks down into metabolites, some of which are also psychoactive, some of which stick around considerably longer. The parent drug might be gone, but its children are still working. More importantly, half-life doesn't mean duration of effect. It means the time for half the drug to leave your system. After one half-life, half is still there. After two half-lives, a quarter. The effects don't stop when the clock strikes midnight on the half-life. They fade gradually, unpredictably, differently in different people. And that's the final piece, the dose-response curve. Ambien works as intended for many people, probably most people. They take their pill, they go to sleep, they wake up rested, nothing strange happens. The clinical trials showed this. The prescribing doctors saw this. Millions of satisfied users confirmed this. But for some people, the curve looks different. Some people metabolize Ambien slowly. Women on average metabolize it slower than men, which is why the FDA eventually 21 years after approval recommended lower doses for women. Older people metabolize it slower. People with certain genetic variations metabolize it slower. People who've had a glass of wine metabolize it slower. For these people, the safe dose isn't safe. The short-acting drug isn't short-acting. The selective binding isn't selective enough. For these people, Ambien doesn't induce sleep. It induces something else, something between sleep and waking, something nobody fully understood when the drug was approved, and nobody fully explained when the prescriptions were written. The clinical trials identified these outliers. They showed up in the adverse event data, but rare was the word that got attached to them. Rare was the word that made it acceptable to keep prescribing. Rare meant somebody else's problem, until rare happened to you, or to your marriage, or to the person lying next to you who suddenly wasn't there anymore. The FDA has a term for what happens when Ambien goes wrong. They call them complex sleep behaviors. This is the kind of phrase that only a regulatory agency could love. It sounds clinical, manageable, like a technical glitch in an otherwise reliable system. Let me translate it into what it actually means. Parasomnia is the medical term for activity during sleep states. Sleepwalking is a parasomnia. So is sleep talking. So is that thing where you bolt upright in bed, terrified, heart pounding from a night terror you won't remember. These are normal parasomnias, common, usually harmless. Complex sleep behaviors are not normal parasomnias. Complex sleep behaviors mean sleep driving. Getting into your car, starting the engine, pulling out of your driveway, navigating streets and intersections and traffic, all while technically asleep. People have driven for miles this way. People have crashed this way. People have killed other people this way. Complex sleep behaviors mean sleep eating. Getting out of bed, walking to the kitchen, consuming everything in reach. Not snacking, consuming. People have eaten raw meat, frozen food still frozen, cigarettes, cleaning products, things no conscious person would put in their mouth. And in the morning they found the evidence with no memory of creating it. Complex sleep behaviors means sleep sex. Initiating sexual contact with partners, with strangers, with anyone present. Sometimes aggressive, sometimes violent, always unremembered. There are court cases about this. Sexual assault cases where the defense was, "I was on Ambien." The legal system still doesn't know what to do with it. Complex sleep behaviors means sleep violence. Attacking partners, family members, anyone who happens to be nearby when something in the sleeping brain decides it's threatened. Punching, choking, worse. People have woken up to injuries on their partners that they have no memory of inflicting. And complex sleep behaviors means sleep talking, but not the mumbling kind, not the incoherent kind, the fluent kind, the confessional kind, complete sentences, complete conversations, complete revelations of things the conscious mind might never have said. This is what the FDA's antiseptic terminology conceals. The mechanism is pharmacological, and it's horrifying once you understand it. Your brain has systems that prevent you from acting out your dreams. During REM sleep, there's a kind of temporary paralysis that keeps your body still while your mind is active. This is protective. This is why you don't punch your pillow every time you dream about a fight. Ambien suppresses the parts of your brain that control inhibition and judgment. It puts the thinking parts to sleep. But it doesn't always put the motor parts to sleep. Sometimes the motor cortex stays active. Sometimes the body stays ready to move, even while the mind is offline. What you get is a person who can walk, talk, drive, eat, text, and do essentially anything a body can do, without the supervision of the person who usually lives in that body. The emergency brakes are off, the steering wheel is unmanned, and something drives anyway. Something walks to the car. Something opens the refrigerator. Something picks up the phone and starts typing messages to people who will read them in horror. The person isn't there, but the body is still moving. What does it feel like to be in this state? What is the subjective experience of being an ambient ghost? The honest answer is that nobody fully knows, because the people in that state don't remember being there. Memory encoding is one of the first things to go. Whatever's happening, it's not being recorded, but there are fragments, partial recollections, the sensation of being somewhere between asleep and awake, neither one nor the other, but something else entirely. Users describe it differently. Some say it's like watching themselves from a distance. Some say it's like being underwater, where everything is muffled and slow. Some say it's like a dream, except the dream is happening in the real world with real consequences. The internet, being the internet, created a character for this state. The ambient walrus. You might have seen it, a cartoon walrus, usually depicted as sinister and persuasive, whispering terrible ideas into the ear of an ambient user. Let's go for a drive. Let's send that text. Let's tell your wife what you really think. The ambient walrus is dark humor. It's how people cope with something genuinely terrifying by making it into a meme. It's also underneath the jokes an attempt to describe something that doesn't have good language, the sense that something else is in control, something that doesn't have your best interests at heart. Here's what the science suggests is happening. In the ambient state, you have partial consciousness, some awareness, some ability to perceive the environment, respond to stimuli, form intentions. You're not in a coma, you're not fully unconscious, you're something in between. You also have full motor control. Your body works, your hands work, your voice works. Everything that allows you to interact with the physical world remains functional. What you don't have is memory encoding. The experiences aren't being recorded. Whatever happens in this state, you won't have access to it later. It's like a security camera that's running but not connected to any storage, and you don't have judgment. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that weighs consequences, that considers the future, that asks, is this a good idea? That part is suppressed. You have impulses without brakes, thoughts without filters, actions without consideration. People describe the ambient state as being piloted by someone who doesn't care about you, and that's exactly what's happening. The part of you that cares about consequences, about relationships, about tomorrow, that part is asleep. What's left is something that responds to immediate impulses with no thought for anything else. The horror isn't unconsciousness. If you were simply unconscious, you'd be still. You'd be safe. You'd wake up where you went to sleep, and nothing would have happened. The horror is consciousness without conscience. A version of you that can do things, say things, destroy things, without the part of you that would stop it. The you that emerges in this state isn't you. Not really. Not the you that makes choices, that values relationships, that understands what words mean and what they do. But it uses your mouth, your hands, your phone, your marriage, and in the morning you get to see what it did. Now we get to the part that destroyed the marriages. The thing that makes ambient different from sleep driving or sleep eating. The thing that leaves no physical evidence but does damage that can never be repaired. The confession effect. Ambien has something in common with alcohol and benzodiazepines and certain other drugs. It loosens tongues. It lowers inhibitions. It creates a state where people say things they would never say sober. But it's worse than alcohol, because with alcohol, there's at least the possibility of remembering. There's at least some continuity of experience. You might regret what you said, but you know you said it. You can apologize. You can explain. You can try to repair. With Ambien, there's no memory, no continuity, no way to know what you said or why you said it. You wake up to accusations about words you have no access to, confessions you can't confirm or deny, a partner who heard something devastating and is now looking at you like a stranger. The pharmacology is straightforward. The prefrontal cortex is where social inhibition lives. It's the part of your brain that says maybe don't tell your wife you find her sister attractive. It's the part that weighs the consequences of honesty, that calculates when truth is useful and when it's destructive, that maintains the careful boundaries between private thoughts and public statements. Ambien suppresses prefrontal function. The result is disinhibition. The social anxiety circuits go quiet. The voice that says don't say that goes silent. The association between thought and consequence dissolves. What's left is raw output. Whatever crosses the mind exits the mouth. Whatever impulse arises gets expressed. There's no editor, no filter, no second guessing. This is why people on Ambien say things they didn't know they thought, things that might be true, things that might be complete fabrications, things that their conscious mind would never have assembled into sentences, but that their disinhibited brain produced anyway. And here's the interpretive nightmare that destroys marriages. If your partner says they don't love you at 3 a.m. while in an Ambien state, do they mean it? They don't remember saying it. They claim not to believe it. Their conscious mind, the one you married, the one that chose you and built a life with you, insists that the statement doesn't represent their actual feelings, but the words came from their brain, their neurons, their stored memories and associations. The Ambien didn't invent the words, it just removed the barriers to saying them. So is it the truth? A hidden truth, finally released from the prison of social constraint, the real feelings your partner has been hiding, now exposed by chemical honesty? Or is it noise? Random neural firing, shaped by a brain that produces language automatically, meaning nothing, signifying nothing, as relevant to their actual beliefs as a dream about flying is relevant to their ability to levitate? Or is it something in between? A fear that got spoken as if it were a fact, an anxiety that got externalized, a thought they had once fleetingly and dismissed, now given voice by a drug that makes dismissal impossible? Nobody knows. And that's the cruelest part. Ambien doesn't reveal the truth. It removes the filter between chaos and speech. The human mind is full of chaos, contradictory impulses, fleeting thoughts, things we consider and reject, things we feel for a moment and then don't feel anymore. Normally there's a process. The chaos gets filtered, the thoughts get evaluated. What we say represents what we've decided to express, not everything that crosses our minds. Ambien removes that process. What comes out is unfiltered, unprocessed, uncurated. It might be truth, it might be noise, it might be something that was true for a moment and isn't anymore. There's no way to know because the conscious mind that could evaluate it was asleep when the words were spoken. The partners who hear these things can't unhear them. You can tell someone, I was on Ambien, I didn't mean it, I don't even remember saying it, and they might believe you. They might understand intellectually that the drug causes confessions that don't represent genuine beliefs. But you can't unhear, I never loved you. You can't unhear, I think about leaving every day. You can't unhear the cruel thing your partner said, even if they don't remember saying it, even if they swear they don't believe it. The doubt moves in. The permanent question takes up residence. What if that's what they really think? What if the Ambien showed me who they really are? The marriages that end after Ambien confessions don't end because of proof. They end because of uncertainty. The impossibility of ever knowing what those words meant. The impossibility of trusting someone whose unconscious mind said things their conscious mind denies. You can forgive a mistake. You can forgive an accident. You can even forgive a betrayal if the person takes responsibility and shows remorse. But how do you forgive something that might not have happened, said by someone who might not exist, representing beliefs that might or might not be real? You don't. You can't. You just live with the doubt until it dissolves the foundation of everything you built together. And that's how a sleeping pill destroys more marriages than cheating ever could. Not through action, through ambiguity, through the permanent, unanswerable question of who your partner really is when their conscious mind goes away. The warnings started almost immediately. Within 2 years of Ambien's FDA approval, adverse event reports began trickling in. Not complaints about grogginess or headaches, complaints about behavior, patients calling their doctors confused and frightened, describing things they'd apparently done with no memory of doing them. A woman in California who woke up in her car, parked outside a convenience store with a bag of groceries she didn't remember buying. A man in Ohio who found his kitchen destroyed, food everywhere, with no recollection of eating anything. A couple in Florida who woke up to find explicit messages on their phones, sent to people they barely knew, in the middle of the night. The reports were scattered. Different doctors, different cities, different circumstances. There was no central clearinghouse where someone was connecting the dots. Each incident looked isolated. Each incident looked like a strange one-off, a medical curiosity, maybe even patient error. Then the sleep driving cases started accumulating. By the early 2000s, emergency rooms were seeing a pattern. People brought in after car accidents who weren't drunk, weren't on recreational drugs, but clearly weren't fully conscious either. People who had driven miles from their homes, sometimes in pajamas, sometimes barefoot, with no memory of getting in the car. Police officers started recognizing it. The person who pulled over wasn't slurring their words like a drunk driver. They were speaking clearly but strangely, present but absent, cooperative but confused. Some officers started asking, "Have you taken any sleeping pills tonight?" The FDA's adverse event database, where doctors and patients can report problems with medications, began filling with ambient entries. Sleep driving, sleep eating, sleepwalking, far beyond typical sleepwalking, sleep sex, sleep violence, a catalogue of behaviors that shouldn't have been possible, happening to people who'd simply taken their prescribed medication and gone to bed. Then came Patrick Kennedy. In May 2006, Congressman Patrick Kennedy crashed his car into a security barrier near the Capitol building at 2:45 a.m. He appeared disoriented. He told police he was late for a vote, though Congress wasn't in session. He showed no signs of alcohol impairment. Kennedy later revealed he'd taken Ambien before the incident. He didn't remember driving. He didn't remember the crash. He woke up in his bed the next day and learned what had happened from news reports. Suddenly, sleep driving was national news. A congressman, a Kennedy, crashing into a barrier on Capitol Hill because of a sleeping pill. The story was everywhere. The questions were obvious. If this could happen to a congressman, who else was it happening to? The answer was thousands of people, at least. Sanofi responded with label adjustments, warnings about driving, recommendations about dosage, language that acknowledged the possibility of complex sleep behaviors while carefully avoiding anything that might suggest the drug was fundamentally dangerous. The prescriptions kept flowing, the marketing kept running, the butterfly kept landing on sleeping shoulders. Here's the math that nobody wanted to do. At peak prescribing, Ambien was dispensed 40 million times annually. If parasomnia events happened in even 1% of users, that would be 400,000 incidents per year. If it was 1/10 of 1%, still 40,000 incidents. The word rare kept getting attached to these events. But rare multiplied by 40 million isn't rare. It's an epidemic hiding in plain sight. And the reports reaching the FDA represented a fraction of actual incidents. Most people who experienced strange ambient behaviors didn't know to report them. They didn't connect their midnight kitchen destruction to the pill they'd taken before bed. They didn't realize the messages they'd sent came from them. They blamed themselves, blamed their memory, blamed anything except the medication their doctor had prescribed. The reporting gap meant the denominator was always understated. The FDA was seeing shadows on the cave wall, not the fire casting them. The warnings were there. The data was accumulating. The pattern was emerging. And the machine kept running. The research that should have changed everything came out piece by piece, study by study, over years. It was never assembled into a single damning report. It just accumulated like snow before an avalanche. The sleep driving studies came first. Researchers began documenting cases systematically, trying to understand the scope of the problem. What they found was disturbing. Sleep driving wasn't a freak occurrence. It was a predictable effect in a subset of users. Certain factors increased risk: taking the medication and not going immediately to bed, combining it with alcohol or other sedatives, being female, being older, taking higher doses. But the most troubling finding was that some people experienced sleep driving even when they followed every instruction perfectly. No alcohol, immediate bedtime, recommended dose. Still, something in their neurochemistry made them vulnerable in ways no one could predict. Then came the next day impairment studies. Remember the short half-life? The marketing promised that Ambien would be gone by morning? Researchers started testing cognitive function in people who'd taken Ambien the night before. What they found should have triggered immediate regulatory action. 8 hours after taking Ambien, significant numbers of users still showed measurable impairment. Reaction time, divided attention, the kind of cognitive functions you need to drive a car or operate machinery. The drug wasn't gone, its effects weren't gone, people were getting behind the wheel believing they were sober when they weren't. In 2013, the FDA finally acted on this data, sort of. They issued a recommendation to cut the initial dose for women in half, from 10 milligrams to 5 milligrams. The reason was the gender differential that studies had been documenting for years. Women metabolize zolpidem more slowly than men. The drug stays in their systems longer. The next day impairment is more pronounced. The announcement came 21 years after Ambien was approved. 21 years during which millions of women had been taking doses that were too high for their bodies. 21 years of car accidents and strange behaviors and marriages destroyed while regulators waited for the evidence to become undeniable. And even then, it was only a recommendation, not a requirement. Doctors could still prescribe whatever dose they wanted. Many did. The memory consolidation research added another layer of concern. Ambien doesn't just affect what you do, it affects what you remember. It interferes with the brain's ability to consolidate new memories. People taking Ambien weren't just at risk of doing things they wouldn't remember. They were at risk of not properly processing the memories from before they took it. European regulators looked at the same data and reached different conclusions. Several European countries set lower initial doses from the start. Their warning labels were more explicit. Their monitoring requirements were stricter. The same drug, the same chemistry, different regulatory response. Why were American regulators slower? The cynical answer points to pharmaceutical industry influence. The revolving door between FDA and industry, the lobbying dollars, the pressure to approve drugs and keep them approved. The less cynical answer points to regulatory philosophy. The FDA has always prioritized access, getting treatments to patients who need them. The burden of proof falls on those who want to restrict, not those who want to permit. The result was the same either way. Data accumulated, studies published, patterns emerged, and the regulatory response lagged years behind what the science was showing. By the time the FDA acted, the damage was already measured in millions of prescriptions, thousands of incidents, and an unknown number of destroyed marriages that nobody was counting. While the FDA moved slowly and Sanofi issued carefully worded statements, a different group of professionals was developing a different kind of expertise. Divorce lawyers started noticing a pattern. It showed up first as a word, Ambien, mentioned in depositions, in client intakes, in the stories people told about why their marriages fell apart. At first it seemed incidental, a detail, a footnote. Then it became a category. Family law attorneys in major cities started comparing notes. Had anyone else seen an uptick in cases involving Ambien? Had anyone else heard the same story, over and over, with different names but identical structure? The stories had a shape. Spouse takes Ambien. Spouse does something unconscionable. Spouse has no memory. Other spouse cannot forgive, cannot forget, cannot continue. The something unconscionable varied. Sometimes it was messages, sexual text to inappropriate people, confessions of affairs that may or may not have happened, cruelty spoken that couldn't be unsaid. Sometimes it was behavior, a spouse who got in the car and drove somewhere they shouldn't have been, a spouse who accessed financial accounts and made decisions, a spouse who engaged in sexual behavior with their partner or with someone else that they would never have chosen consciously. The cases posed legal challenges that law school hadn't prepared anyone for. Can you divorce someone for actions they took while unconscious? Is it adultery if your spouse doesn't remember it? Is it financial misconduct if they didn't know they were doing it? More importantly, does it matter? The legal questions had legal answers. Fault and no-fault divorce, division of assets, custody arrangements. Courts had frameworks for handling these things. But the emotional reality didn't fit the frameworks. A woman sits in a divorce attorney's office. She's holding her phone. On the phone are messages her husband sent to his ex-girlfriend at 3 a.m. Explicit messages, detailed messages, messages that describe specific acts, specific desires, specific memories from their relationship years ago. Her husband swears he was asleep, swears he doesn't remember, swears he doesn't want his ex-girlfriend, has never wanted his ex-girlfriend, loves his wife and only his wife, and maybe he's telling the truth. Probably he's telling the truth. The Ambien explains it, the science supports it, but the messages exist. She's read them, she can't unread them, and she doesn't know, will never know, whether those messages came from some hidden part of him that the Ambien released, or whether they're pure neurological noise, signifying nothing. Can I trust him? She asks the attorney. The attorney doesn't know how to answer that. Trust isn't a legal concept. Trust isn't something a court can adjudicate, or a settlement can restore. The marriage ends, not because of what he did, because of what she can't know. The cases kept coming. Each one slightly different, all of them the same. The man who proposed to his ex-girlfriend via text while sleeping next to his wife. Not a flirtation, a proposal, a detailed explanation of why they should be together, why he'd made a mistake, why she was the one he truly loved. His wife read it in real time, watching his thumbs move on the screen while he appeared to be asleep. She thought it was a joke, then a test, then a nightmare she couldn't wake from. He didn't remember any of it. The marriage didn't survive the wondering. The woman who called her mother-in-law at 2 a.m. and said everything she'd held back for 15 years, every criticism, every resentment, every petty grievance she'd swallowed in the name of family harmony. Her mother-in-law recorded part of it, played it back. The voice was clear, the words were devastating, and the caller had no memory of picking up the phone. The mother-in-law never forgave her. The husband couldn't choose between them. The marriage collapsed under the weight of things that couldn't be untaken back. The couple where both were on Ambien. They fought, they screamed, they said things to each other that neither would ever have said consciously. In the morning, neither remembered the fight, but the children remembered. They'd heard everything. They told their parents what had been said, what had been threatened, what had been revealed about how mommy and daddy really felt about each other. The parents looked at each other with no memory of the battle but full knowledge of its casualties. The divorce attorneys developed unofficial expertise. They learned to ask about sleep medications during intake. They learned to recognize the pattern. They learned to tell clients, gently, that the court could divide the assets but couldn't give them back their certainty. The marriages that ended weren't ending because of Ambien. Exactly, they were ending because of doubt. The permanent, corrosive, unanswerable doubt about who your partner really is when the conscious mind goes away. Here's where the story would be simpler, if there were a smoking gun. An internal memo where Sanofi executives acknowledged they were selling a marriage destroyer and decided to keep selling it anyway. A cover-up, a conspiracy, something clean and villainous. The reality is more complicated, and in some ways more damning. Sanofi knew about the parasomnia effects. Of course they knew. The adverse event reports went to them. The lawsuits named them as defendants. They had pharmacovigilance teams whose job was to track exactly these kinds of problems. Their response wasn't to hide the data. Their response was to manage it. When challenged about sleep driving, Sanofi pointed to alcohol co-use. Many of the reported incidents involved patients who'd had a drink before taking Ambien. The company's position was clear. If you mix Ambien with alcohol, bad things happen. But that's not the drug's fault. Follow the instructions and you'll be fine. This was technically defensible and practically misleading. Yes, alcohol increases risk, but cases kept emerging where no alcohol was involved. People who'd followed every instruction, avoided every warning, and still found themselves driving cars or sending texts they couldn't remember. When challenged about next-day impairment, Sanofi pointed to individual variation. Some people metabolize the drug differently. Some people are more sensitive. The drug works as intended for most users. The outliers are unfortunate but unavoidable. This framing shifted responsibility from the drug to the patient. If you had a problem, you were the problem. Your metabolism, your sensitivity, your failure to go immediately to bed. The drug was fine. You were defective. When challenged about the marriage-destroying confessions, Sanofi had no real response. These effects weren't even on the radar in any formal way. Nobody was tracking relationships ended due to Ambien-induced statements. Nobody was counting those casualties. Internal communications that emerged during litigation painted a picture of a company aware of the risks and focused on managing liability rather than addressing harm. Discussions of label language, of warning placement, of how to acknowledge problems without creating legal exposure. The business calculus was simple. Ambien was generating over $2 billion annually at its peak. The adverse events, however frequent, weren't killing enough people to trigger the kind of regulatory response that would threaten that revenue. The lawsuits could be settled or defended, the warnings could be adjusted, the sales could continue. Was this a cover-up? Not in the dramatic sense. The data existed. The warnings, however inadequate, existed. Nobody was shredding documents in the dead of night. But there's another kind of cover-up. The kind where you know something's harmful, and you do the minimum required to avoid liability while the harm continues. The kind where you watch the casualties accumulate and calculate that the profits outweigh the costs. Sanofi made that calculation. The FDA made a version of that calculation. The doctors writing 40 million prescriptions made individual versions of that calculation. And the marriages kept ending uncounted and unaccounted for, invisible in any metric that anyone in power was tracking. The problem with invisible casualties is that eventually some of them become visible. In 2012, Kerry Kennedy, daughter of Robert F. Kennedy, was arrested for driving erratically on a New York highway. She'd sideswiped a tractor-trailer, kept driving, and was eventually pulled over by police. She appeared disoriented, slurring her words, confused about where she was. Her blood showed no alcohol, it showed zolpidem. Kennedy said she'd taken Ambien the night before and must have unknowingly taken another dose in the morning, mistaking it for her thyroid medication. She had no memory of the drive, no memory of the collision, no memory of anything, until she was standing on the side of the highway talking to police. She was acquitted. The jury accepted the Ambien defense. She hadn't intended to drive impaired. She hadn't known she was impaired. The drug had acted without her consent or awareness. Kennedy's case made national news because she was a Kennedy, but she was far from alone. By the mid-2010s, Ambien-related driving incidents had become their own category of traffic accident. Some ended in minor fender benders, some ended in fatalities, people killed by drivers who were technically asleep, who would wake up in a jail cell with no memory of the crash that brought them there. The legal system struggled with these cases. Criminal law assumes intent. You can't commit most crimes accidentally, but what about a crime committed while unconscious? What about a killing done by someone who wasn't there? The Ambien defense became a recognized legal strategy. It rarely resulted in full acquittal, but it often reduced charges or sentences. Juries had sympathy for defendants who seemed genuinely horrified by their own actions, who clearly had no memory or intent. Then came the violence. Domestic assault cases where the accused had been asleep, where they'd attacked partners, family members, strangers with no awareness or memory, where they'd woken to find injuries they'd inflicted and victims they'd terrorized. And the murders. A small number, but not zero. People who killed while in Ambien states. People who stabbed or strangled or shot other human beings and claimed, sometimes credibly, that they'd been unconscious the entire time. These cases posed the hardest questions. A person is dead. Someone killed them. The evidence points to a specific individual, but that individual has no memory of the killing, may have been in a state that precluded intent, may have been as much a victim of the drug as the person they killed. The law requires intent. Ambien erases intent. The damage remains. What do you do with that? How do you hold someone responsible for actions they didn't choose, didn't remember, might not even have been aware of as they occurred? The courts are still figuring it out. Each case gets decided individually, with judges and juries weighing factors that don't fit neatly into legal frameworks designed for conscious actors making choices. Meanwhile, the prescriptions continue, the marriages continue to end, the accidents continue to happen. The violence continues to erupt from the space between sleep and waking where Ambien sends its users. The headlines come and go. A Kennedy acquitted, a driver sentenced, a murder trial with an unusual defense, and then the news cycle moves on, and the drug that made the headlines remains on the shelves, in the medicine cabinets, on the nightstands of 40 million Americans who just want to sleep. By now you understand the science, you understand the regulatory failure, you understand the corporate calculations, but understanding the system isn't the same as understanding what it did to individual lives. So let's get specific. Let's categorize the wreckage. Category 1, the confession bomb. These are the things said in parasomnia states that can't be verified or dismissed. The statements that might be truth or might be noise, that land like grenades in the middle of marriages and detonate without anyone knowing what they actually contained. I've always loved someone else, said at 3 a.m. to a spouse of 15 years, said without memory, without context, without the possibility of explanation. Is it true? Has there always been someone else, some secret carried for a decade and a half, or is it neural garbage, the brain producing sentences from stored words without any connection to actual belief? The spouse who hears it will never know. The person who said it can't tell them. The confession exists in a quantum state, simultaneously true and false, destroying regardless of which it turns out to be. I only married you because I was pregnant. Your body disgusts me. I think about leaving every single day. I've been faking it, all of it, for years. Each of these sentences has been spoken by someone on Ambien to someone they loved. Each of these sentences has ended marriages, not because they were necessarily true, but because once spoken, they can't be unspoken. The wound is identical, whether the blade is real or imagined. Category 2, the digital affair. The smartphone turned Ambien parasomnia into a precision weapon against relationships. In the old days, you could sleepwalk to the kitchen, eat everything in the refrigerator, and the only evidence would be crumbs and confusion. The damage was containable, self-inflicted, between you and your digestive system. Now, sleepwalking includes texting, includes social media, includes dating apps. People on Ambien have messaged ex-partners with explicit propositions, have matched with strangers on Tinder and arranged to meet, have sent photographs they would never have sent consciously, have engaged in sexting sessions with co-workers, neighbors, their spouses' friends, their spouses' family members. The phones remember even when the users don't. The messages sit there, time-stamped, undeniable. The partner who discovers them can scroll through an entire conversation their spouse has no memory of having. I wasn't there is the only explanation available. It's also the one that sounds most like a lie. Category 3, the financial bomb. Online shopping while unconscious. It sounds almost comical until you see the credit card statements. People on Ambien have spent thousands, tens of thousands on purchases they don't remember making, have bought cars, have made investments, have gambled away savings on sites they don't remember visiting. The financial damage is quantifiable. The marital damage from the breach of trust, from discovering that your partner did something with your shared money that they can't explain, is not. Some people found hidden accounts accessed, passwords entered, funds transferred, by fingers that moved without conscious direction to destinations the conscious mind never chose. Category 4, the violence. This is the category nobody wants to talk about. People on Ambien have attacked their partners, have grabbed, pushed, punched, choked, have woken up to injuries they don't remember inflicting, to partners who are terrified of them, to police reports they can't dispute because the bruises are right there. The morning after, did I do this to you? The answer is yes. The memory is no. The marriage is over. These categories aren't mutually exclusive. Some marriages ended with confession bombs and digital affairs. Some ended with financial betrayal and violence. The taxonomy is for understanding. The reality was chaos. Let's go back to Ohio, back to Michael and Sarah, back to the bedroom at 2:47 a.m. where this story started. We left them with Sarah reading the messages, Michael returning to bed, the marriage about to end. But marriages don't end in a moment. They end in the days and weeks that follow, in the slow unraveling of what was supposed to be permanent. The morning after, Michael came downstairs and Sarah showed him the phone. She watched his face as he read. She was looking for recognition, for guilt, for the flicker of awareness that would tell her he knew exactly what he'd done. What she saw instead was horror. Genuine, bewildering horror. His face going pale, his hands starting to shake. His voice cracking as he said over and over, "I didn't do this. I don't remember this. This isn't me." She wanted to believe him. Part of her did believe him. The science was real. The parasomnia was documented. She'd even Googled it after he fell asleep. In those quiet hours before dawn, reading about Ambien and sexting and the things people did that they couldn't remember. But the messages were to her sister, not a stranger, not a random contact. Her sister, with whom Michael had a perfectly normal relationship, with whom he'd shared family dinners and holiday gatherings for over a decade. Why would his unconscious mind choose her? What did it mean that somewhere in his brain, without his consent or awareness, there were thoughts about her sister explicit enough to put into words? She didn't have an answer. Neither did he. Neither did the couple's therapist they started seeing the following week. The therapy sessions were exercises in futility. Traditional couples therapy assumes both parties have access to their experiences, their motivations, their choices. You discuss what happened, why it happened, how to prevent it from happening again. Michael had no access. He could apologize, and he did, endlessly, but he couldn't explain. He couldn't promise it wouldn't happen again because he didn't know how to control something he wasn't conscious for. He couldn't even confirm that the thoughts in those messages weren't his real thoughts, because how would he know? How does anyone know what's in the parts of their mind they can't see? Sarah tried. She really tried. She loved him. She knew intellectually that the Ambien was responsible. She understood the pharmacology well enough to accept that her husband hadn't chosen to send those messages. But understanding isn't the same as trusting. Knowing isn't the same as feeling. Every night, when they went to bed, she wondered who would wake up next to her. Every time his phone buzzed, she flinched. Every interaction between Michael and her sister, unavoidable, they were family, carried a weight it had never carried before. The marriage lasted 6 more months, not because of a single breaking point, but because of the accumulated weight of uncertainty, the constant question she couldn't stop asking and he couldn't answer. Do you want my sister? Is that who you really are? That wasn't me, he said, again and again in the final argument. That wasn't me. I would never do that. I love you. Only you. That wasn't me. Then who was it? She asked. Who was in our bedroom that night? Who sent those messages? Because somebody did. Somebody wearing your face and using your hands. And I have to sleep next to you not knowing if he's coming back. The divorce was uncontested. They split their assets amicably. They told their friends it was a mutual decision, that they'd grown apart, that sometimes these things just don't work out. They didn't tell anyone about the messages. Sarah's sister never knew. The secret stayed between them, a piece of wreckage buried where no one else could see it. Michael stopped taking Ambien. He never had another parasomnia event. He was fine, medically speaking, but the marriage was gone. The life they'd built was gone. And the worst part, the part that neither of them could escape, was that there was no one to be angry at. No villain, no bad guy, just a pill, a brain, a body, and a set of words that couldn't be unsaid. There's no closure when there's no memory. There's no forgiveness when there's no understanding. There's just the wreckage, and the silence, and the question that never gets answered. The partners left behind have their own specific hell. Think about what it means to be betrayed by someone who wasn't there, to have evidence of infidelity or cruelty or deception, without having anyone to confront about it. Normal betrayal, as devastating as it is, offers a path forward. You confront the betrayer, you demand explanations, you get answers that might be lies, but at least they're answers. You fight, you rage, you grieve, and eventually you decide whether to forgive or leave. The betrayer participates in this process. They defend themselves, or they apologize, or they admit what they did and why they did it. Ambien betrayal offers none of this. You confront your partner, and they look at you with genuine confusion. You demand explanations, and they have none to give. You ask why, and the only answer is, I don't know. I wasn't there. You're left arguing with a ghost. The person who hurt you doesn't exist in any accessible sense. They emerged from your partner's body, did damage, and disappeared. Your partner is both responsible and innocent, both the perpetrator and another victim. How do you process that? The partners left behind describe a specific kind of torture. I don't know if he meant it. I'll never know. He says he doesn't believe those things, and I believe that he believes that. But the words came out of his mouth. His brain formed them. Some part of him, some unconscious part, thought those things were worth saying. How do I know that part isn't the real him? She swears it never happened consciously, and I believe her. I know about Ambien. I know what it does, but it happened. The messages are on my phone. The words are right there. I read them every night for weeks, trying to understand. I'll never understand. How do you trust someone who turns into someone else every night? He stopped taking the pills, and nothing else has happened. But I lie there waiting, every night, wondering if tonight's the night the other one comes back. The divorces that followed these incidents weren't really about Ambien. They were about uncertainty. The partners left behind weren't leaving because their spouses had done something unforgivable. They were leaving because they couldn't live with not knowing if the confession was true, not knowing if the messages represented real desire, not knowing who would be lying next to them when the lights went out. Humans can adapt to almost anything except uncertainty. We can live with hard truths. We can't live with not knowing what the truth is. Ambien destroyed marriages by creating permanent unknowns, questions that couldn't be answered, doubts that couldn't be resolved, wounds that couldn't heal because no one could determine what had actually been cut. We've spent most of this story looking at the partners, the victims of Ambien behavior. But there's another group of victims, the users themselves, the people who took a prescribed medication for a legitimate purpose and woke up to discover their lives were over. Imagine being told what you did. Someone sits you down, a spouse, a police officer, a lawyer, and describes actions you have no memory of, shows you evidence you can't dispute, texts you don't remember sending, purchases you don't remember making, injuries you don't remember inflicting. The evidence is undeniable. The phone records are there, the credit card statements are there, the bruises are there. Everything points to you, to your body, to your hands, to your words, and you have nothing. A blank space where the memories should be, a gap in your own biography that other people have filled in with accounts of things you apparently did. You're responsible. You know you're responsible. Your body did these things. Your brain generated these actions. The legal system will hold you accountable. But you have no access to the responsibility. You can't examine your choices because you didn't make choices. You can't understand your motivations because you didn't have motivations. You can't even apologize properly because apologizing requires acknowledging what you did and you didn't do anything. Something using your body did things. You weren't there. This is a specific kind of hell. I destroyed my own life in a state I don't remember, one user wrote in an online forum. My wife left me for messages I sent. I can't argue that I didn't send them. The evidence is right there, but I also can't apologize for something that doesn't exist in my memory. I can't take responsibility for a choice I never made. The damage is real, the guilt is real, but the act itself is a void, a nothing where something terrible apparently happened. Some users couldn't live with it. There are no comprehensive statistics on suicides among Ambien users who experience devastating parasomnia events. Nobody's tracking that. It would be bad for business to track that. But the forums know, the support groups know. The people who've lived through Ambien incidents know that some people don't live through them. Some people wake up to what they've done, to the marriages they've destroyed, to the lives they've shattered, and they can't find a way to keep existing in bodies that betrayed them. They weren't addicts. They weren't criminals. They weren't bad people. They were insomniacs who wanted to sleep, who trusted their doctors, who took their pills as prescribed. And then they weren't there anymore. Their bodies did things. Their lives ended. The system that gave them Ambien didn't track what happened next. The drug companies count adverse events. The FDA counts hospitalizations and deaths from overdose. Nobody counts the people who couldn't survive the shame of becoming someone else in the dark. They're invisible casualties, uncounted, unacknowledged, absent from any metric that might make someone question whether this drug should still be on the market. But they're real. They were here. They took their Ambien and went to bed expecting to sleep, and in a sense, they never woke up. Here's the thing about Ambien that should terrify you more than anything else we've discussed tonight. Ambien isn't unique. Ambien isn't an aberration. Ambien isn't the one time the system failed. Ambien is the system working exactly as designed. Let me show you the pattern. OxyContin, approved in 1995, marketed as a breakthrough in pain management. The slow-release formulation Purdue Pharma promised made it safe, less addictive than other opioids, appropriate for moderate pain, not just cancer patients, Less than 1% of users would become addicted, the sales representatives claimed, citing a study that said nothing of the sort. The marketing was aggressive. The research suggesting problems was minimized. The regulators were slow to act. By the time the truth became undeniable, hundreds of thousands of Americans were addicted. Tens of thousands were dead. The crisis continues today. SSRIs, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, the antidepressants that were supposed to be safe enough for everyone. They were marketed to the masses, prescribed for everything from major depression to mild anxiety to shyness, rebranded as social anxiety disorder. Then the suicide data emerged, particularly in young people, particularly in the early weeks of treatment. The drugs that were supposed to prevent suicide were, in some patients, increasing the risk of it. The warnings came eventually. Years after the prescriptions started, after the damage was already measured in bodies. Hormone replacement therapy, Premarin, Prempo, marketed to menopausal women as the fountain of youth. Protect your heart, protect your bones. Stay young, stay vital, stay on these hormones indefinitely. Then the Women's Health Initiative study revealed the truth. Increased risk of breast cancer, increased risk of stroke, increased risk of blood clots. The therapy that was supposed to protect women was hurting them. The study was stopped early because continuing it would have been unethical. The pattern is always the same. A drug gets developed. The marketing is beautiful. The promises are enormous. The clinical trials show benefits, and the adverse events get categorized as rare, manageable, acceptable given the benefits. The drug gets approved, the prescriptions flow, the money pours in, the problems emerge. Slowly at first, scattered reports, anecdotal evidence, researchers raising concerns that get dismissed as preliminary, inconclusive, not enough to warrant action. The problems accumulate, the evidence becomes undeniable, the regulators finally act, years or decades after they should have. And the human cost? The human cost was paid long before the warning labels changed. The human cost was paid by people who trusted the system, trusted their doctors, trusted that someone was watching out for them. Ambien followed this pattern perfectly, marketed as safe, prescribed by the millions, problems dismissed as rare, regulators slow to act, patients paying the price while the system worked through its processes. The business model doesn't change because the business model works. The drugs generate billions, the lawsuits cost millions. The math is simple. The executives keep their jobs, the patients keep their side effects. This is the system. This is how it functions. Ambien isn't a failure of the system. Ambien is the system succeeding at what it's actually designed to do. So if all of this is true, the parasomnia, the destroyed marriages, the regulatory failures, the pattern that keeps repeating, why is Ambien still on the market? Why do doctors still prescribe it? Why do pharmacies still fill it? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Ambien helps people. Millions of people. People who couldn't sleep, who were suffering, whose lives were being destroyed by insomnia in a different way. They took Ambien, and they slept. They woke up rested. They functioned. They didn't send messages they couldn't remember or drive cars they didn't know they were driving. They just slept. The sleep crisis is real. We established that. Tens of millions of Americans can't sleep, and the consequences of not sleeping are severe. The demand for a solution isn't manufactured. It's genuine. It's desperate. And the alternatives? They're limited. The newer Z drugs, Lunesta, Sonata, work on similar mechanisms. They have similar risks. The newer non-Z drug sleep aids have their own problems. Nothing works as reliably as the sedative hypnotics, and nothing comes without trade-offs. So doctors prescribe Ambien because their patients need help, and Ambien provides it. Most of the time, for most people, the risk-benefit calculation gets made millions of times a year. On one side, reliable sleep induction, improved quality of life, a patient who can finally rest. On the other side, a small chance of parasomnia, a small chance of next-day impairment, a small chance of something going terribly wrong. Most of the time, the calculation comes out in favor of prescribing. But here's what the calculation doesn't include. The FDA tracks deaths. The FDA tracks hospitalizations. The FDA tracks adverse events severe enough to be reported. The FDA doesn't track divorces. Nobody's counting the marriages that ended. Nobody's tallying the relationships that dissolved. Nobody's measuring the trust that was destroyed, the families that fractured, the lives that came apart, not because someone died, but because something worse happened. The risk-benefit calculation is incomplete because the risks it counts are incomplete. The benefits are quantified, the costs are undercounted, and so the prescriptions continue. 40 million a year at peak. Doctors helping patients, patients trusting doctors, everyone pretending the full cost has been measured when it hasn't been. So what should have happened? Start with the warnings. From the beginning, not warnings buried in fine print that nobody reads. Warnings that are impossible to miss. This medication may cause you to do things you won't remember, including driving, eating, having sex, and communicating with others. These behaviors have destroyed marriages and ended lives. Not may cause drowsiness, not use caution when operating machinery. The actual risks in language that actual humans would understand before they take the first pill. Start with the doses. Lower for everyone, not just for women. 21 years too late. Lower starting doses across the board, with careful titration upward only if needed. The European approach. The approach that American regulators knew about and didn't implement, because the FDA doesn't like to look like it's following Europe's lead. Implement screening. Before every prescription, questions about alcohol use, about other medications, about prior history of sleepwalking or sleep disorders. Identify the patients at highest risk before they become casualties. Mandate education. Not a pamphlet that goes in the bag with the pills. Actual education. A conversation with a pharmacist or a nurse. This is what this drug can do. This is what you need to watch for. This is what your partner needs to know. Most importantly, fund the alternatives. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. It exists. It works. Studies show it's as effective as medication for chronic insomnia, with effects that last longer and side effects that don't include destroying your marriage. But CBTI requires trained therapists. It requires multiple sessions. It requires time and attention and resources that cost money. Insurance coverage is spotty. Availability is limited. Most insomniacs couldn't get CBTI even if they knew it existed and wanted to try it. Why is a pill easier to get than therapy? The answer isn't complicated. Pills are profitable. Pharmaceutical companies make billions from sleep medications. They fund research, they lobby regulators, they advertise to consumers, they send representatives to doctors' offices. Therapy isn't profitable, not in the same way, not at the same scale. There's no Therapy Incorporated spending billions to promote the benefits of talking to a trained professional about your sleep hygiene. So the pills flow and the therapy doesn't. The profitable option is available. The effective but less profitable option is scarce. The system produces the outcome the incentives dictate. This isn't conspiracy, it's just capitalism. Resources flow toward profit. Sleep medication is profitable. Sleep therapy isn't. The prescriptions continue because the money continues, not because the outcomes are optimal. We could have done better. We could still do better. The knowledge exists. The alternatives exist. The path forward is clear to anyone who looks at it honestly. The question is whether anyone with power is willing to look. Let me leave you with the question that started this journey. The question that haunts every marriage Ambien touched. The question that the science can't answer and the philosophy can only circle. Who are you when you're on Ambien? It sounds like a simple question. It's not. The Western conception of identity assumes continuity of consciousness. You are the same person from moment to moment, day to day, year to year, because your consciousness persists. Your memories accumulate. Your experiences build on each other. There's a through line, a narrative, a self that exists across time. Ambien breaks that continuity. When you take Ambien and enter a parasomnia state, something that uses your body takes actions your conscious self doesn't authorize, doesn't remember, doesn't have access to. The through line is severed. The narrative has a gap. The self that exists across time has a hole in it. So who took those actions? Your brain did. Your neurons did. The electrical and chemical processes that constitute your nervous system did. In that sense, you did. There's no one else in there. No demon possession, no alien takeover, no external force hijacking your body. But yourself didn't. The conscious entity that makes choices, that weighs consequences, that feels responsible for actions because it chose them, that entity was absent, asleep, offline, not there. If your brain produces an action but yourself isn't present, who is responsible? The law struggles with this question. Philosophy struggles with it. The marriages that burned certainly struggled with it. Because here's the horrible truth. It doesn't matter. The question is fascinating intellectually. It makes for great late-night conversation. It touches on deep issues of consciousness and identity and free will that humans have been debating for millennia. But the messages were still sent. The words were still spoken. The trust was still shattered. The marriages still ended. The philosophical uncertainty doesn't undo the damage. The metaphysical complexity doesn't rebuild the relationship. The question of who is responsible doesn't matter to the partner who heard "I never loved you" at 3 a.m. and can't unhear it. The marriages that were destroyed weren't destroyed by choice, but they're destroyed. We medicate ourselves into states we don't control. We take pills that dissolve the boundaries of our identity. We enter territories where our bodies act without our consent, and our brains produce outputs we can't verify. And then we wonder why we can't trust ourselves. We wonder why our partners can't trust us. We wonder why the foundations we built on the assumption of continuous selfhood crumble when the self turns out to be more fragile than we thought. Ambien didn't create this fragility. Ambien just exposed it, showed us that the self we take for granted, the continuous narrative we call me, can be interrupted by a small white pill, and whatever happens in the gap doesn't stay in the gap. The question won't go away, because the question doesn't have an answer, not one that helps, not one that heals. There's just the gap, and what emerges from it, and the wreckage it leaves behind. Right now, somewhere in America, a doctor is writing a prescription. It's the end of a long day. The patient sitting across the desk looks exhausted. Dark circles, slumped posture, the look of someone who hasn't slept properly in weeks, maybe months. They've tried everything. The sleep hygiene, the meditation apps, the melatonin. Nothing works. The doctor nods sympathetically, reaches for the prescription pad, writes the name of a medication that will help. That usually helps. That helps most people, most of the time. The doctor doesn't mention parasomnia, doesn't describe complex sleep behaviors, doesn't explain that some patients have driven cars, sent messages, destroyed marriages, all while technically asleep. There isn't time. There's another patient waiting. The warnings are on the label. Probably, right now, somewhere in America, a pharmacist is filling that prescription, counting pills into an orange bottle, printing a label, attaching the paperwork that nobody reads. The pharmacist has filled this prescription 1,000 times. It's routine, standard, one of the most common sleep medications in the country. The pharmacist doesn't ask questions, doesn't offer counseling beyond the basics, doesn't say, by the way, this drug might make you do things you won't remember, and some of those things might end your marriage. That's not in the workflow. That's not part of the job. Right now, somewhere in America, a patient is reading that label, squinting at the small print. May cause drowsiness. Do not operate heavy machinery. Avoid alcohol. Standard warnings. Nothing alarming. Nothing that suggests the medication in their hand might unlock a version of themselves they've never met. They put the bottle on the nightstand. They'll take it tonight. They'll finally sleep. Everything will be fine. Right now, somewhere in America, a partner is falling asleep next to someone who might not be there in the morning. They don't know that. They're just tired. It's been a long day. Their spouse took their sleeping pill, same as always. The bedroom is quiet. The house is dark. Everything is normal. They don't know that in 3 hours, or 4, or 5, the person next to them might get up, might pick up their phone, might say things, type things, do things that will still be there in the morning when the person who did them has no memory of doing them. They don't know they might wake up to a stranger wearing their spouse's face, looking through them like furniture, having a conversation with someone else entirely. They're just falling asleep, same as every night. The internet made a joke out of this. The Ambien Walrus, a cartoon character representing the chaos that emerges when the conscious mind goes offline. The Ambien Walrus wants you to go for a drive. The Ambien Walrus thinks you should text your ex. The Ambien Walrus has some things to tell your wife. The memes are funny. Dark humor usually is. It's how people cope with things too terrifying to face directly. But underneath the jokes is the terror, the recognition that something real is happening, that people are losing control of their bodies, their words, their relationships, that the gap between consciousness and oblivion isn't empty. Something lives there, something with access to your hands and your phone and your marriage. 40 million prescriptions, millions of nights, millions of bedrooms where someone takes a pill and crosses into territory they don't control. How many strangers have visited those bedrooms? How many marriages have been touched by what emerged in the dark? How many partners have woken up to messages they couldn't explain, confessions they couldn't verify, a person who wasn't there? Nobody knows, nobody's counting. Right now, somewhere in America, it's happening again. The pill is still there, on nightstands across America, in medicine cabinets, in pharmacies ready to be dispensed, in doctors' offices ready to be prescribed, still marketed, the advertisements still run. Different branding now, generic competition, but the same promise. Sleep, rest, relief from the exhaustion that grinds you down. Still legal, still FDA approved, still covered by insurance, still available to anyone with a prescription, which is anyone who asks and doesn't have an obvious contraindication, still destroying things nobody's counting. Marriages ending in uncertainty, relationships dissolving in doubt, trust evaporating because the question "who are you at 3 a.m." has no answer. The casualties accumulate in silence. No database tracks them, no metric includes them. They're invisible to the system that keeps the pills flowing, absent from the calculations that determine whether a drug should stay on the market. This is the American solution. Medicate the symptom, ignore the cause. We can't sleep because our lives are structured against sleep, because we work too much and rest too little, because screens blast blue light into our eyes until midnight, because anxiety keeps our brains spinning when they should be shutting down, because the systems we live in treat sleep as expendable, as laziness, as time stolen from productivity. So we take pills to force sleep, to override the wakefulness our lives create, to chemically induce the rest our circumstances deny us. And the pills create new damage, new problems, new casualties in the form of marriages that burn and relationships that break, and people who become strangers to themselves and everyone who loves them. And then we take more pills to manage the anxiety from the broken relationship, to address the depression from the divorce, to sleep again after the Ambien stopped working or scared us too much to continue. The cycle doesn't end, the pattern doesn't break, it just finds new substances, new mechanisms, new ways to medicalize problems that aren't medical and create casualties that nobody counts. The pill on the nightstand is a symptom, the sleeplessness is a symptom, the shattered marriages are a symptom. We keep treating symptoms because treating causes would require changing systems, and systems are harder to change than prescriptions are to write. So the prescription gets written, the pill gets swallowed, the body crosses into the space between sleep and waking, where something else takes over, where the self goes quiet and whatever remains does whatever it does. And in the morning, we wake up, or we wake up to wreckage, or we wake up to questions that will never be answered. Picture a bedroom, any bedroom, your bedroom maybe, 2 people, 1 pill, a nightstand, a lamp, the ordinary furniture of ordinary life, the space between consciousness and oblivion, where we send ourselves voluntarily every night across America, trusting that we'll come back, trusting that nothing will happen in the gap, trusting that the person who fell asleep will be the person who wakes up. 40 million prescriptions say we keep making that trust, keep taking that risk, keep crossing into territory we don't control and hoping we'll return unchanged. Some of us do, most of us do, and some of us don't. Some of us wake up to a world that shifted while we were gone, a partner who looks at us differently, a phone full of evidence, A marriage that was whole when we fell asleep and isn't anymore. The pill doesn't know the difference, the pill doesn't care. The pill just does what it does, night after night, in bedrooms across America. And somewhere right now, someone is reaching for it, hoping for sleep, expecting rest, trusting that everything will be fine. The same trust millions have placed before them, the same hope, the same reach toward the nightstand in the dark. The pill is still there. The bedroom is waiting. The space between sleep and waking is always open. And what happens there, what emerges, what speaks, what destroys, nobody knows until morning.